This presentation discusses how to revise newly developed instructional materials. My name is David Lewis, and in this ongoing series of presentations, we're discussing the Dick and Carey model. Revision is an important part of instructional design and goes hand in hand with formative evaluation. Dick and Carey included revision in their instructional design model for a reason. This is because to develop strong instruction, instructional designers must revise their material several times by considering the instruction at all levels. Instructional designers must analyze several types of data and analyze their results to make revisions. Then they can revise their instruction from a data-driven perspective. In this presentation, we consider these types of data analysis techniques listed here, and then we'll cover each of these in the context of revisions and formative evaluation. You may remember from a previous presentation that Dick and Carey described three phases of formative evaluation. Following each of these phases, an instructional designer revises the product. During the first phase of the formative evaluation, the designer may work one-on-one with a learner. This one-on-one interaction can be described as a learner observation. During this observation, the designer considers the thoughts, feelings, and opinions of the learner, but they also consider the learner's interactions with the materials. This all produces data to be analyzed and evaluated during the first revision. These revisions happen between the formative evaluation phases. So there are three revisions in a formative evaluation. During this first revision, there are 5 types of data that can be considered. I'll go over each of these. Since the designer has interacted one-on-one with 3 to 5 learners, they can now describe what are known as learner characteristics in great detail. That is, they can consider misconceptions and entry skills of the learners that they have interacted with. In addition, they can talk about a learner's responses to the instruction. So, for instance, an instructional designer can show a list of performance times for each of those learners that they worked with. But more importantly, they can also now describe how well those learners performed. Dick and Carey tend to focus on exams or test questions as a performance, or in other words, test performance. So in their terms, you can state how well the learners did on a post-test. Depending on your learner or your learner performance, you may have a learner perform some action as a part of your instruction, separate from a test performance. That is, you may actually have them do something else. That too can be considered, and each of these learners can be considered individually. So, how well did they do? Finally, you may also use a questionnaire to gauge learner motivations and perceptions. Each of these are the 5 types of data that can be considered during Revision 1. As you will recall, the second phase of a formative evaluation is a small group evaluation. The purpose of this phase is to evaluate the product in context of a small group, probably less than 20 learners. As Dick and Carey suggest, think of this as a group rather than a series of individuals. So consider group variables like group averages for learning and performance time. These are simple statistics that will be very helpful. Are these learners performing with the times that you expected, for instance? Dick and Carey provide a short introduction to item analysis and discuss several techniques for considering item performance on the pre-test and post-test. Consider their textbook for a discussion of their techniques. A truly thorough discussion of item response theory is really beyond the scope of this course, or definitely beyond the scope of this presentation. However, Dick and Carey also discuss several other variables that can be considered during a second stage revision. They mention responses to an attitude questionnaire. Questionnaire development is not too difficult, although it's a little bit time consuming, and a thorough explanation of questionnaire statistics is a little bit beyond this course. But as they suggest, you can make some simple observations from questionnaire results. Sometimes a pie chart like this one is useful to understand how a group of learners felt about a set of instructional materials. Finally, a third phase is a field trial. This is otherwise known as a beta test. This stage in the design process is when you should conclude your revisions. The data from the field trial could be extensive, so set some goals for revisions and accomplish those goals and end your revisions. To be thorough, the instructional designer needs to consider the effectiveness or efficiency of the instruction and do so in the context of the learning components. So as you design the formative evaluation, on some level you're designing those revisions too. So it's very important that you do this with the correct data in mind as your outcome of your evaluation. As Dick and Carey suggests, you can do this by using the learning components. And that will be your underlying evaluation structure. But as you do so, focus on the types of data that you'll receive. These data will help you to revise your instructional materials. So let's consider these data types by each learning component. Here on the left, of course, are the learning components. You've seen those several times in these presentations by now. Each of these will be paired with a type of data in this table, and then we'll consider a source of that data, in this case the data collection instrument. So let's start with the pre-instructional activities and consider first the entry-level skills and determine, do those learners have what it takes to do your instruction? And you can learn this by actually considering the learners themselves. You can consider their motivation as well as it relates to these activities. Are you motivating those learners at this stage? The way we do this is to find out from the learners and to check and see if we're actually doing our job. To do that, you just interview the learner. Also, you may want to develop an attitudinal questionnaire. This will help you determine if the learner's opinions and perceptions are what they need to be of your instruction. Next is the content presentation. Of course, you will want to know how well the learners performed as a result of your instructional materials. Look at the post-test scores and compare those to the pre-test scores. This is called a post-test item analysis. That is, really, you're looking at each item in the test and analyzing those post-test items. You may also want to see if the learners thought your materials were what they expected. So develop questions for a questionnaire, and that'll be some indication of what they thought. Did they think it too difficult, for instance, or was it just too easy? The next learning component is learner participation. At this point, you should be concerned with what the learners thought about the opportunity to participate. Do they feel that they were provided with enough opportunities? Ask them in a questionnaire. Now, as for the assessments, remember you are assessing if the learners actually learned what you wanted them to. So this part of data collection should be focused on your pre-tests and post-tests. You can perform an item analysis, as I mentioned, as they discussed in the textbook as well. Also, it's a good idea to consider an item by objective performance analysis. That is, develop a table which shows each learning objective and how well the learners perform by each objective. The textbook has a good description of this type of analysis. In addition, there are performance checklists for simpler procedural instruction. You just check off when they actually did a step in the procedure correctly. Finally, we come to the follow-through activities. Remember, the purpose of follow-up activities is to promote transfer performance. Typically, there is an assessment assigned to this with assessment items based on transfer performance. This will allow you to use an item analysis for this type of instruction. Now then, before we conclude this presentation, there's a small but very real problem that happens with instruction and some instructional designers. It's called seeking perfection. As an example, let's imagine you get to the field trial and you find out that the instruction has some issues with it. Well, revise it. That's not a problem. Well, however, as this evaluation and revision process is going on, some instructionals find it very difficult to call a product complete. In other words, they can find themselves in a never-ending loop. Or, depending on the instructional designer, it may be something called feature creep. The thought here is that you could add just one more thing to make it better. And then there's just one more thing to make it better. And that goes on and on. At some point, you are going to have to call it done. And to do this, set a goal for what done actually means, and for the product to really be complete. That is, produce a to-do list. And when you complete that list, it's time to call the product done, or at least version 1.0. And at that point, it's really ready for the world. If you think about it, there are many software products that are constantly being revised, and there's a new revision every year or so. Microsoft Office, for instance, has gone through revision after revision after revision for 30 years or so. Your product could have a revision even after you call it finished. But to allow that product to actually be used by learners, call it finished, and then come up with a list of revisions for version 2.0. Well, that brings us to the conclusions. In this presentation, we discussed revisions as they relate to the instructional design process and to formative evaluations. Basically, it all boils down to data-driven decision making. That's the whole point of revisions, or the way Dick and Carey describe it. That's the whole point. This data comes from the formative evaluation itself, but the evaluation needs to be designed too, and that means it needs to be designed to give you the right data. A table was shown that should help you think about these data collection techniques. Similar tables were in the textbook. You can design a similar table if you want based upon your formative evaluation. This table should then be presented in a formative evaluation plan and then performed according to that plan in the actual evaluation. Well, that concludes this presentation. We have one more presentation on summative evaluations. But again, that happens really outside the instructional design process. So we kind of have finished the instructional design process. Well, until next time, goodbye.